thank you for stopping on my video. My name is Beccie and this is BecxReadz. I post videos every 5 days, and if I can manage, I will squeeze some in between. And today I have an original tag for you guys in collaboration with several of my favorite fellow romance reading booktubers. But before I get into the tag, could you hit that subscribe button for me down below if you haven't already? It would really help my channel grow, and I would love for you to be here with me. Today being a Valentine's Day, I thought, what a better way to celebrate this day of loving the people around you, loving yourself, than to reflect on your romance journey, specifically your romance reading journey. So myself, along with 9 other of my fellow lovely romance reading booktubers, came together to create this original tag called the Romance Journey Book Tag. I will have all of their channels tagged down below, so please go give them all a follow if you haven't already. If you're already following me, you probably follow them already, but if you're not, go give them a follow. I will also have a playlist link down below where you can find all of the videos that we are releasing today, and if you yourself do this tag, please let me know, tag me in it, so that way I can add your video to the playlist as well. So let's jump into this romance journey book tag and see where my journey began and see where it's at now. So the first question I asked, and it is about how old were you when you started reading romance, and do you remember the first romance you read? I was a very late bloomer when it comes to reading. I did not love reading when I was a teen or even a kid. I did it because I had to, but I didn't discover my love of reading till I was 20 years old. So I was a little bit late, and I would say that's where I found my love of reading romance. The first romance book that I ever read, I do remember what it was, and that was a very underrated young adult paranormal romance called Twilight. This was the book that got me hooked on reading. My mother gave it to me for Christmas when I was 20 years old, and I haven't been able to stop reading since. Now, when it comes to my first adult romance, I do know that one as well. It was Kiss of Midnight by Laura Adrian. So you can see the progression here. I went from a young adult paranormal romance to adult paranormal romance. So that is where my romance started. Question 2 comes from Crystal at Crystal's Bookish Life. Did you deliberately seek out romance, or did you stumble upon it, and how? I would say that I deliberately stumbled upon it because I did ask my mom to buy me Twilight when I was 20. At the time, there was this vampire show on like CBS or NBC. It was called Moonlight, and I loved this show. It was a vampire romance show. And so my coworkers told me, if you love that show, you should try Twilight. It's very similar. FYI, it's not. The only thing similar is vampires. So I deliberately asked my mom to get me Twilight, and she did. And then once I started reading that, I deliberately sought out other vampire romances to read. The next question comes from Kelsi at Ruffalo Reads. And did you start with traditionally published romance or indie, and has it switched? So obviously I started with trad pub romances. I would say back when I found my love of reading, indie really wasn't an option. It was like the very beginning stages of like when e-readers were coming out. That tells you how old I am. So ebooks and indie publishing just weren't as popular as they are now. Nowadays, however, I tend to read more indie published romances. I honestly can't even remember the last time I went into a bookstore. Oh yes, I can. It was on one of my bookstore adventure vlogs. I lied. Okay, so I did go into a bookstore recently and buy some traditionally published romances, but it's very rare that I do that. Nowadays, if I go into like a Barnes & Noble, I'll go to the romance section, but I'm always on the lookout for those indie books, and I can always tell when they're indies because of the spine and usually the cover art and things like that. And those are the ones that I'm drawn to more so the traditionally published. So it has changed dramatically for me. And I find that I actually do prefer indie published now to traditionally published. The next question comes from Jess at Honest Fiction. What was a romance trope you were afraid to try but ended up loving? I don't think there's ever been a trope that I've been particularly afraid to try. I feel like I have gone the entire sphere of subgenres and tropes that are out there. However, if you had told me like 3 years ago that monster and alien romances would have been something that I would have loved so much, I would have thought you were crazy because I didn't even know that was a thing a few years ago. I will say there's some tropes that I've tried that I didn't particularly love that I don't ever see myself going back to. Those being love triangles. That used to be my bread and butter in the beginning of my romance reading journey. I loved that shit so much. Nowadays, I refuse to read a love triangle romance because I hate them. I know I will hate them. Every book that I've read after a certain point in my life that has had a love triangle, I have rated lowly. So I steer clear of those now. Also, anything that has to do with like incest or incestuous vibes, I stay away from that too. At one point, I tried the whole stepbrother romances, and there was even one with like a stepdad romance. It gave me the ick. I can do them if they're very like estranged, sort of. Like if you have an older stepbrother, stepsister who are just meeting each other in like an adult marriage type situation where they've never grown up, I can do those. But if you give me like stepbrother, stepsister who have grown up together, or stepchild, stepparent who have raised one another, yeah, I can't do those. I can't do those. They just creep me out and give me the ick so bad. So I wouldn't say I'm afraid of them, but I've definitely found some that I steer clear of. The next question comes from Caitlin at the Love Librarian. Is there a romance you read early on in your reading journey that you would rate differently today? And to this, I would say most definitely every single one of them. I found that when I reread certain books that I loved like 10 plus years ago, oftentimes they will get a lower rating. Or sometimes with the case of like Dragon Actually, where I reread it for the first time in 10 years last year, it went from a 4 to a 4.5 star rating. So they often do change by slight degrees. There were some darker like bully romances that I read way at the beginning. Two of them that I can think of are these two. Loved these books when I first read them, right? I reread them in 2020 as part of my figuring out my top 10 books of the decade. I hated these books. I gave them like 2 stars on reread. Did not enjoy them. 50 Shades of Grey, that's another one. Loved it when it came out, specifically 2 and 3, not so much 1. But the more that I reread them, the lower my rating got for them. I think it's just a byproduct of reading so much romance, and as you get older, your tastes change. So I definitely think that any book that I've ever reread, I would rate differently now. The next question comes from Bree at In Love and Words. And how has your taste in romance evolved over the years? I started out with young adult paranormal romance. I read the entire young adult paranormal romance that was available to me at the time. And once I exhausted myself from that, I then moved on to adult paranormal romance, where I found things like Cressley Cole, Laura Adrian, J.R. Ward, and from there it went into like the humorous paranormal romances like Lindsay Sands, Carolyn Sparks, things like that. And then it evolved from paranormal to contemporary. I went through a whole contemporary phase of Susan Mallory, Jill Shelvis, Kristen Higgins, those type of books, Julia London. I had a brief moment of historical romances, especially Scottish historical romances. If it had a Scotsman in it, I read it. And then when I went to college for culinary arts to start out with, so I was reading foodie romances, and then that was the time that the Kindle got released about, and I discovered ebooks, and that just opened up a whole nother world for me. I graduated college, and then my like hockey romance era started. I read a ton of hockey romance. From there, I went into dark romance and bully romances, which was a very short phase because I found that I didn't like those so much. Then I did a brief stint of Christian romances, and then I went back to paranormal, and then I found fantasy romance, and fantasy romance is where I'm at currently. I am in my fantasy romance zone, and I've also just started my monster romance, alien romance period too. So my romance journey has gone all over the place. It's hit all the tropes, it's hit all the subgenres, and I tend to stay with a certain niche for a while until I find something else, and then I'm in that, and then it'll go back, and it's like a wave. The next question comes from Kaylani at Kaylani Simply Me. What is the most powerful romance that you have read that left a lasting impact? So there have been a lot of romances that I've read that have really stuck out to me. I could like pinpoint certain books that really made me fall in love with a certain trope or genre or something, but I think the romance that has stuck with me the longest and that has impacted my life the most is probably Outlander. This was one that my sister-in-law, she told me I should read, and I started it, and it took me a while to get into it because it was really boring in the first few chapters. But once Claire goes back in time, that is when I got sucked in. That is when I got hooked. And I binge read all of those books in like 2 weeks' time. And they are some thick mofos too. So that tells you how much I enjoyed this series. This is the series that made me want to go to Scotland. And I was like, oh, I want to go there because, you know, I was like, oh, I want to touch some stones and see if I can travel back in time like the dork I am. And so that was my dream for the longest time, was to go to Scotland. And I did it. I did it last year. It was so great. I loved it. I didn't go on like any Outlander tours or anything like that. I went specifically to Edinburgh because that's where I wanted to go. But this book made an impact on me, and it stuck with me. It really like connected me to my sister-in-law more, and it like formed a bond between us that we didn't have prior to that. There was just something about these characters that made an impact on my life overall. And I just love Jamie. It definitely had an impact on me. The next question is a doozy. It comes from Jackie at First Lady Reads. What was the romance book that told you this is what I'm looking for in my personal life and or with a partner? Jackie, my babe, you really dug deep for that one. That is a freaking excellent question that I never would have thought to ask. This took some thinking because I'm like, what, has any really done that for me? Because while I see a lot of things in fictional romances and I'm like, oh, that would be nice to have in reality, a lot of it is unrealistic. But I am going to have to say Radiance by Grace Draven. When I read this book, it was the first time that I thought to myself, this has things in it of their romance that I don't think are that unrealistic to expect in a real relationship. I want somebody who's my friend. I want somebody who looks past my flaws and who loves me despite them. I want somebody who communicates with me, who shares their feelings and their fears and what they're going through. I want to help somebody go through those trials and tribulations in life. I want somebody who's protective of me and cares for me, but also isn't going to tell me you can't do this. And that's the first time that I had read that within a book that encompassed the whole relationship. Like, there are things in other books where you could pinpoint like, oh yes, I would like that, or I would like that. But as a whole, there's also things about them that you wouldn't want in a real relationship or partnership. But Ildiko and Brishan's relationship, I want this. I want everything that they have together. So that was an excellent freaking question. And this is my favorite book. So I don't know why it took me so long to figure out that answer. The next question comes from Ava at Ava's Romance Books. Which romance books would you recommend to a romance newbie, and which ones would you recommend to a seasoned romance reader? For a romance newbie, I'm going to recommend 2 books that I have actually recommended to people who don't typically like reading romance, and they have loved both of these. So the first is, of course, Radiance. I got many of people to read this book who didn't like reading romance, and they loved this book. They liked that it was very low fantasy, but it had a fantastical plot to it, and they liked the mature, low angst couple and how well they communicated and things like that. And the other one is Hawthorne and Heathcliff by R.K. Riles. This is a good one if you're a younger reader, especially because it does transition from young adult romance into adult romance. It's very low on the smut, so it's a great way to introduce yourself to the romance genre without being bombarded with the crude, smutty books. But it has a great romance in it. It deals a lot with grief as well. So it handles some more nuanced topics other than just romance. And I actually got my friend Jessica to read this book too. And she doesn't like romance either. And she really enjoyed this. She also really enjoyed Radiance as well. So these 2 I think would be a great duo for people who are just starting out in romance. As for a seasoned romance reader, I don't have a book specifically to recommend for this, because if you're a seasoned romance reader, I feel like you have read everything there is to read. The only thing I could recommend with this is maybe try your hand at the weirder romances. Try your hand at dark romances. Try your hand at monster romances. Lean into that weird, dark space, because I feel like if you have read everything else, maybe that is a space that you've you might have dipped your toe into, but you might not have fully gone into it. And I think if you're seasoned in that way, you can handle the darker and the weirder romances that are out there. I don't have any suggestions for you because I don't know what you have read and what you haven't read. And the final question comes from Sam at Sam Reads a Little. In your eyes, what are 3 perfect romances? This was another toughie, Sam. My goodness, you're really making me think. Okay, so of course I'm going to go with Radiance as my top perfect romance. This is a perfect romance to me personally. It has everything that I love and everything I want from a romance. I don't actually know of 2 other books that I could give for a perfect romance because while I've loved a lot of romances, there's always something in a romance that is, you know, not perfect. So what I'm going to do instead is I am going to be very vague with my answer here. And I think the perfect romance books are those romance books that make you feel, that evoke emotion from you, whatever those are. It can be sadness, it can be happiness, it can be grief, it can be anger, it can be frustration, hell, it could be horniness, you know? Whatever it evokes a strong emotion, I think that is a perfect romance for people to read. And I think another example of a perfect romance, in my opinion, would be something that you could recommend to somebody who's 20 or 100 and they would be able to get something from it. If the author is able to get people from different age demographics, different societal backgrounds, different experiences, different trauma levels to connect with a story and the characters and feel for those characters, I think that is a perfect romance. I know that's a super vague answer, but that's the best I can do. And lastly, tag a couple fellow romance readers. So I am going to tag Jack at Jack in the Book Stack, Hannah at Hannah Blackwell, and just for funsies, I doubt he'll see this video or do it, but I'm gonna tag Gavin at How to Train Your Gavin because I know he's read some romances and I would be curious to see his answers. So thank you so much for watching my romance reading journey. Be sure to check out my fellow creators of this tag down below and also check out that playlist for their videos. And if you are still here, could you leave me the heart emoji? Any heart emoji will be fine. And until my next video, thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a lovely Valentine's Day. Bye.